The moment the question left the host's mouth, the entire studio went silent. The energy in the room shifted, the laughter and applause from just moments ago disappearing like air sucked from a vacuum. Chris Hemsworth, seated under the glare of stage lights, his face relaxed but his jaw tightening just slightly, felt it before he even had time to process the words. "Chris, do you remember July 14th, 2019? It wasn't the question itself, but the way it was asked. Not casual, not friendly banter between a Hollywood star and a seasoned talk show host. It was surgical, deliberate, a scalpel cutting through the perfectly crafted narrative of the night. The kind of question that wasn't asked unless someone already knew the answer. The audience, a sea of expectant faces, was frozen in that space between curiosity and anticipation, waiting for something, waiting for a reaction. Chris tilted his head just slightly, a barely perceptible shift, and smiled the way he always did. Easygoing, confident, unfazed. "That's an oddly specific date," he said, his voice carrying just enough amusement to disarm, to play along. "Should I?" The host, Dean Carter, leaned forward with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, fingers tapping against the cue cards in his lap, his rhythm precise, like a man who knew he was about to land a punch. "Well, someone thinks you should, because they say that day changed everything for them." The weight of the moment settled before Chris could fully grasp it. He could feel the slightest shift in the air, the almost imperceptible inhale from the audience, the way the stage crew, people who had seen 100 celebrity interviews and had stopped caring long ago, were suddenly paying attention. This wasn't just a setup for a light-hearted story about a fan interaction or an amusing behind-the-scenes moment from a film set. This was something else. Dean gestured toward the side of the stage. "Let's bring them out." The applause was hesitant, confused, a scattered ripple rather than the usual thunderous welcome. Chris turned his head, his stomach tightening, but his face gave away nothing. He had been in this business too long to let anything slip before he understood exactly what was happening. And then, from the shadows of backstage, a figure emerged. Chris's breath caught for just a fraction of a second, but to anyone watching, he looked the same. Cool, collected, the unshakable presence they had seen 1,000 times before. But inside, something twisted. Because he knew. Before they even fully stepped into the light, he knew who it was. And suddenly, July 14th, 2019, didn't feel so far away anymore. The figure was a man in his early 30s, wearing a fitted black jacket over a plain white shirt. His hair was shorter than Chris remembered, his face leaner, sharper, the kind of face that had been worn down by time and experience. But his eyes were exactly the same. Chris kept his expression steady, offering a polite, neutral smile as the man approached. He stood just off-center, microphone in hand, as the audience murmured, trying to place him, trying to understand why the atmosphere had suddenly thickened with something unspoken. Dean leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "Chris, meet Nathan Carter." Chris didn't blink. He had known his name before Dean had said it, had known the second he saw him. But hearing it spoken out loud, hearing it in front of millions of people, changed something. Nathan cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't comfortable, but he wasn't nervous, either. He had something to say, something he had carried for too long. "Hey, Chris." His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it, something unresolved. Chris nodded, his voice just as smooth, just as composed. "Hey, mate." Dean glanced between them, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. He knew exactly what he had orchestrated. This wasn't just a talk show segment anymore. This was something personal, something raw. Nathan looked out at the audience for a brief moment, scanning the faces, the lights, the cameras, before turning his gaze back to Chris. "I'm guessing you don't remember me." Chris's jaw tightened, but he kept his smile in place. "It's been a while." Nathan let out a soft breath, something between a chuckle and an exhale of disbelief. "Yeah, it has." He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head slightly before looking back at Dean. "You want to tell them, or should I?" Dean grinned, leaning forward like a man watching a fire he had just lit. "Oh, I think this is your moment, Nathan." The room was silent. Even the people who had come for light-hearted entertainment, for movie teasers and behind-the-scenes jokes, could feel that something was happening, something they weren't prepared for. Nathan took a step closer, just enough so Chris had no choice but to hold his gaze. July 14th, 2019. You were in Melbourne, filming something. I don't even remember what. But that night, you walked into a bar. And so did I. Chris's fingers curled slightly against the armrest of his chair, but his face didn't change. Nathan continued, his voice steady, but carrying something deeper now. You were with some people. I was just there, having a drink. And then, out of nowhere, something happened. Something you probably don't even think about. He exhaled slowly. You saw me, and for whatever reason, you decided I didn't belong there. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. Chris didn't react, didn't move, but his mind was racing, combing through memories, trying to place the moment, trying to grasp what Nathan was saying before the next words came. Nathan's lips pressed together, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or something close to it. You told me to leave. In front of everyone. You didn't say it nicely. You didn't just ask me to move. You made sure everyone saw it, made sure they knew that I wasn't someone who should be there. And I left. Because I didn't have a choice. The audience was silent. Not even a cough. Not even a murmur. This wasn't just an accusation. This was something else entirely. Chris exhaled through his nose, slow, careful, his mind piecing things together, the weight of the moment settling onto his shoulders. Nathan took a step back, adjusting the microphone in his grip. I don't want an apology. I don't care about that. But you get to sit here, in front of the world, and be the guy everyone loves. And I get to be the guy who remembers that night differently than you do. Chris opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his career, he didn't know what to say. The silence in the studio was suffocating. The audience, the crew, even the host. Everyone was frozen, caught between the shock of Nathan's words and the expectation that Chris would somehow smooth it over, turn this into another easy conversation, another entertaining anecdote. But this wasn't something he could laugh off, wasn't a scripted moment where he could charm his way through the tension. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, waiting, assessing, wondering what he would do next. Dean Carter, ever the showman, leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying just enough intrigue to keep the moment alive. Chris, do you remember this? He wasn't giving him an out. He was pushing him deeper into it, watching to see how he'd handle it. Chris kept his expression neutral, but his mind was moving fast. He didn't remember it, not the way Nathan did. Melbourne, 2019. A bar, a group of people, a situation that, to him, had clearly been nothing but had left this man standing in front of him with years of resentment carved into his face. He didn't doubt Nathan's version, didn't dismiss it as a lie, but it wasn't his memory. That night, whatever had happened, had passed through his life unnoticed while it had clearly stayed in Nathan's. Chris exhaled carefully, choosing his words as precisely as he ever had. I don't remember it the way you do. He saw Nathan's jaw tighten slightly at that, saw the flicker of something in his eyes, but Chris continued before he could cut him off. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. That doesn't mean you're wrong. Nathan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. You don't remember because it didn't cost you anything. It wasn't some defining moment for you. It was just a bad night in a bar. You probably left and never thought about it again. But for me, that night didn't end when I walked out. I lost my job 2 weeks later. I was already struggling, and when you humiliated me in front of all those people, it was the beginning of everything falling apart. Chris felt the audience shift, felt them turn toward him, waiting for his response, waiting for him to either justify himself or crumble under the weight of what was being said. His throat was tight, not from guilt, but from the sheer impossibility of the moment. He had spent his life being careful, being conscious of how he treated people, of how his actions affected those around him. But here was proof, undeniable, standing in front of him, that at some point he had failed. And worse, he hadn't even noticed. Nathan's fingers tightened around the microphone, his voice lower now, more measured, as if he had been waiting years to say this and wasn't going to let it get lost in theatrics. I watched you from a distance after that. Not because I wanted to, but because you're everywhere. You're the good guy, the hero, the man who people admire. And I kept thinking, what if they knew? What if they knew that the guy they all look up to is someone who can walk into a room and tear a person down without even remembering their face? Chris swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. He could feel Dean watching him, enjoying the spectacle, waiting for a reaction, waiting for something dramatic enough to make headlines. The cameras were rolling, capturing every second, and he knew that no matter what he said next, it would be dissected, analyzed, twisted into whatever narrative people wanted to believe. He could deny it. He could say Nathan was exaggerating, say it had never happened like that there was another side to the story. He could fight back, push the moment aside, control the narrative. But he knew what that would look like. He had seen others try to talk their way out of situations like this, seen how it only made things worse, how the truth, whatever version of it existed, always found its way to the surface. So instead, he did something no one expected. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and looked Nathan directly in the eyes. "I don't have an excuse," he said, his voice even clear. "I don't remember doing that to you, but I believe you. And if what you're saying is true, then I was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect this to make anything better for you. But I won't stand here and pretend that your experience doesn't matter just because I don't share the memory of it." The room was still. The audience wasn't sure what to do with this version of Chris Hemsworth, the man who wasn't arguing, who wasn't trying to shift blame or dismiss what was being said about him. Nathan, too, seemed caught off guard, his shoulders tensing as if he had been prepared for a fight, not for this. Dean, ever the performer, tried to bring the tension back into the moment. "So, Chris, what do you think should happen next? This is live TV, after all. The world is watching." Chris exhaled through his nose, a flicker of something crossing his face that only those paying close attention would have caught. Annoyance. Not at Nathan, but at Dean, at the way he was turning something real into entertainment, at the way this man's pain was being used for ratings. He turned back to Nathan. "What do you want from me?" His tone wasn't defensive, wasn't dismissive. It was a genuine question. Nathan's expression flickered, just for a second. He hadn't expected that. He had expected to fight. He had prepared for anger, for denial, for the moment when he could expose Chris Hemsworth as nothing more than an act. But this was real. He hesitated, looking down at the microphone in his hand, his fingers tapping against it lightly, his thoughts shifting. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less certain. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I did. I thought calling you out on live television would give me something. Closure. Justice. But now I don't even know what that means." Chris nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then let's figure it out." The audience murmured, confused. Dean blinked, clearly thrown off balance. Nathan just stared at him, trying to understand if he was being played, if this was just another polished, PR-friendly response. But there was nothing fake about Chris's expression. Chris leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only Nathan could hear. "This moment, right here, it's yours. Not mine. I don't want to walk away from this just looking like the guy who handled it well. I want to make it right. So tell me how." Nathan swallowed hard. He had spent years waiting for this confrontation, for the moment when he could finally say everything he had kept inside. He had pictured a dozen different versions of how it would go, but none of them had gone like this. And for the first time since stepping onto the stage, he didn't know what to do next. Nathan's grip on the microphone tightened as he stared at Chris, the weight of the moment pressing down on him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent years running through this confrontation in his head, building the perfect speech, preparing for the anger, the denial, the empty apology meant only to smooth things over. But now, with the cameras rolling, the audience holding their breath, and Chris looking at him not with defensiveness, but with something dangerously close to sincerity, he realized he had no idea what to do next. Dean Carter, sensing the tension slipping from his grasp, leaned forward with a smile that didn't quite hide the eagerness in his eyes. "Well, Nathan, you've got the world's attention. Chris just asked you what you want. That's a rare opportunity." His voice was smooth, controlled, but there was something calculated in it, something that made it clear he was less interested in resolution and more in keeping the moment alive for the sake of the show. Nathan exhaled sharply, his eyes flicking toward Dean, recognizing exactly what he was trying to do. He could feel the expectation thick in the air, the audience waiting for him to demand something dramatic, something that would turn this moment into something unforgettable. But what? An apology? A public statement? Money? He didn't want any of that. He didn't even know what he wanted anymore. Chris, still seated, still steady, spoke before Nathan could. "I don't want this to be a moment that people forget about when the next headline comes along," he said, his voice quieter than before, but carrying the same calm certainty. And I don't want this to be about the cameras or the ratings or making sure everyone walks away thinking I handled it well. I just want to know how to make this right for you. Nathan clenched his jaw. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that Chris meant it, that this wasn't just another well-trained celebrity response, but he had spent too many years watching people like him talk their way out of things to trust so easily. His fingers drummed against the microphone, his mind cycling through 1,000 possible responses, but none of them felt right. The audience was shifting, their murmurs growing as they sensed the hesitation. This wasn't going how they expected. It wasn't the explosion of emotion they had been waiting for, wasn't the dramatic downfall of a beloved star, wasn't the moment where a man got his justice in front of millions. It was something quieter, something more uncertain, and that made them restless. Dean, unwilling to let the moment die, leaned back in his chair, the smirk returning to his face. Nathan, let's be real here. This is the kind of thing most people never get, the chance to hold someone accountable in front of the world. You've got him in the hot seat. What do you want from him? Nathan turned to look at Dean fully, his expression hardening. I didn't come here to make a spectacle out of this. Dean's smirk faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly. Then what did you come here for? Nathan hesitated. He could feel the impatience growing, the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides. He had wanted this moment so badly, but now that he had it, nothing felt the way it was supposed to. He looked back at Chris, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint that this was just another performance. But there was nothing. Just a man waiting for an answer, waiting to be told what to do next. He let out a breath, shaking his head. I don't know, he admitted, and the audience reacted with a mix of murmurs and confusion. This wasn't the big reveal they had been hoping for. This wasn't the kind of confrontation that ended with someone walking off stage or breaking down in tears. It was real, and real was messy. Chris nodded slowly, like he understood. Then let's figure it out. Nathan frowned slightly, caught off guard by the ease of the response. How? Chris leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze steady. I don't know yet, but I'm not going to let this end here. You don't have to decide right now what you want from me, but when you do, you'll know where to find me. Dean let out a short, almost nervous laugh, clearly unhappy with where this was going. Well, that's an interesting approach. Most people would take the opportunity to clear their name or wrap things up neatly, but I guess we're leaving things open-ended. Chris's eyes flicked toward him, his expression unreadable. Because it's not about me. The room went quiet again. Even Dean didn't seem to know how to respond to that. Nathan studied Chris for a long moment, trying to decide if he believed him. He had expected resistance, expected excuses, expected a man who had been in the spotlight for so long to protect himself above all else. But instead, Chris was giving him something he hadn't prepared for, control. Nathan let out a breath and nodded once. All right. He wasn't sure what that meant yet, but it was all he could say. Dean, seeing his show slipping away from him, forced a chuckle and turned back toward the camera. Well, folks, this is definitely one for the books. Not the explosive ending some of you might have expected, but hey, live television, right? The audience clapped, but it was subdued, uncertain. They had come for a spectacle, but they had witnessed something different. Something that didn't fit neatly into the usual talk show format. Chris stood, offering his hand to Nathan. For a brief second, Nathan hesitated, unsure if he wanted to take it. But then he did. The handshake wasn't dramatic, wasn't for the cameras. It was quiet, an acknowledgement that something had started here, even if they didn't know what it was yet. Dean forced another laugh as he gestured to the cameras. That's all the time we have tonight, folks. Give it up for Chris Hemsworth and Nathan Carter. The applause was polite, but the energy in the room had shifted. As the stage lights dimmed and the cameras powered down, Chris turned to Nathan, lowering his voice so only he could hear. This isn't over. I meant what I said. Nathan studied him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. We'll see. And with that, the show ended. But for Chris, for Nathan, for everyone who had watched, the real conversation had only just begun. The cameras had powered down, but the weight in the air hadn't lifted. The audience had begun filing out, murmuring amongst themselves, their expectations unsettled by the lack of a clear ending. The crew moved methodically, wrapping up cables, adjusting lighting rigs, but every so often, one of them would glance over, curious, waiting to see what Chris Hemsworth would do next. Dean Carter had already made his exit, leaving behind only the faint echo of his voice as he no doubt rushed to craft the perfect headline for tomorrow's news cycle. The show was over for everyone else, but Chris knew the real conversation had only just begun. Nathan stood off to the side of the stage, his body tense, his fingers still curled slightly, as if gripping the microphone that had been his shield only minutes earlier. His eyes darted toward the exit once, just once, before settling on Chris again. He had the option to walk away, to end this here and let the world turn it into whatever story they wanted, but something in his stance suggested that wasn't what he wanted anymore. Chris loosened his tie, rolling his shoulders slightly as he took a step closer. He wasn't in a rush, wasn't trying to make a statement. He just needed to close the distance, to make it clear that this wasn't about the cameras, wasn't about PR. It was about two people standing in the wreckage of something neither had seen coming. You weren't expecting that, were you? His voice was calm, but there was no amusement in it, just quiet observation. Nathan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. No, I thought you'd deny it, spin it, make me look like a liar in front of millions of people. He reached for the microphone again out of habit before realizing he didn't need it anymore, setting it down on the stage stool beside him. You didn't. Chris nodded slightly. Because I wasn't trying to win anything. I just wanted to listen. Nathan scoffed, crossing his arms, his expression unreadable. Listening doesn't undo anything. Chris ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. I know. That's why I asked you what you wanted. Nathan's jaw tightened, his body still holding onto the tension of the past few years, his mind still struggling to reconcile what was happening now with what he had expected. I don't have an answer for you. Chris glanced around at the near-empty studio, at the stagehands who were pretending not to listen, at the glow of the overhead lights dimming as the night wound down. Then he looked back at Nathan, his voice steady, his posture unwavering. Then let's not end it here. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly. What do you mean? I mean, let's talk. Not here, not with cameras, not with a host trying to turn it into something for ratings. Just us. You and me. Chris's tone was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't just saying this to smooth things over. I need to understand what that night meant for you. Nathan let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his hand over his face. Why? Because you deserve more than just a moment on live TV. And because I need to know the full story. Nathan hesitated. He had spent years preparing for this, picturing a dozen different versions of how this would go. He had expected the denial, the dismissal, the fake apology meant to make the headlines go away. He had expected anger, maybe even some kind of legal threat. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone actually willing to listen, to sit in the discomfort and take responsibility for something they didn't even remember doing. He didn't know what to do with that. Chris watched him carefully, not pushing, not rushing, just waiting. He had spent his career mastering the art of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. And this was one of those moments where words wouldn't mean anything if they weren't chosen carefully. I don't want this to be something we both walk away from with unfinished business. Nathan's fingers twitched slightly, his mind still caught between instinct and logic. He had been so prepared for resistance that he wasn't sure how to respond to acceptance. He exhaled, looking away for a moment before finally nodding. Fine, let's talk. Chris didn't smile, didn't act like he had won anything, because this wasn't about winning. It was about understanding. It was about finally facing the things that had gone unseen for too long. The crew was still clearing out when Chris motioned toward the back door of the studio, away from the crowds, away from the media waiting outside. There's a cafe down the street. No cameras. Just us. Nathan hesitated again, but then, after a long pause, he nodded. All right. And as they walked off the stage together, it was clear that whatever had started tonight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cafe was almost empty when they arrived, the late hour leaving only a few scattered customers and a barista who barely looked up as they entered. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow over the rain-slicked pavement. Chris gestured toward a booth in the corner, away from the windows, away from the curious glances of anyone who might recognize them. Nathan hesitated only a second before following, sliding into the seat across from him. Neither of them spoke as the barista approached, placing two menus down before retreating without waiting for an order. Chris leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, watching Nathan carefully. No cameras, no audience. Just us. Say what you need to say. Nathan let out a sharp breath, tapping his fingers against the edge of the table before looking up. You really don't remember it, do you? Chris shook his head, not out of dismissal, but because he knew lying would be pointless. I don't. But that doesn't mean I don't believe you. Nathan studied him for a long moment, searching for cracks, for any sign that this was some calculated attempt at damage control. When he found nothing, his shoulders dropped slightly, the tension shifting but not disappearing. That night, I wasn't supposed to be at that bar. Not because I wasn't welcome, but because I wasn't in the right headspace. I had just lost someone. My brother. A week before. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words settled between them, making the already quiet cafe feel even more still. Chris's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, listening more intently now. Nathan continued, staring at the table as if watching the memory play out in front of him. I wasn't drinking to have fun. I was drinking because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to be home. I didn't want to be anywhere that reminded me of him. And then you walked in. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. You were with a group. I don't know if they were friends or just industry people, but you were laughing, taking over the place like it belonged to you. I wasn't paying attention until someone bumped into me, spilled my drink all over my shirt. And then you turned, and I swear, the second you looked at me, I knew. Chris tilted his head slightly, watching him closely. Knew what? Nathan's lips pressed together for a moment before he spoke. That you weren't seeing me as a person. Just another guy in the way. Just someone who didn't belong in whatever world you were living in that night. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. You didn't yell. You didn't make a scene. You just dismissed me. You told me to leave like I was a problem that needed to be solved. And the worst part was that nobody questioned it. Not your friends, not the bartender, not even me. I just walked out. Because what else was I supposed to do? Chris's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers curling against the table, not in frustration with Nathan, but with himself. I don't know why I did that. Nathan let out a humorless laugh. Neither do I. But it stuck. I walked out of there feeling like I had been kicked out of my own life. Like the world had decided I wasn't supposed to be in it anymore. And maybe that sounds dramatic, but when you've already lost someone, when you're already standing on the edge of something dark, it doesn't take much to push you over. Chris's breath was slow, controlled, but inside, something twisted. He had spent years making sure he wasn't that kind of person, making sure he didn't turn into the version of fame that swallowed people whole, that made them forget what it meant to be decent. But this wasn't some exaggerated tabloid story, wasn't a misunderstanding that could be explained away. Nathan was sitting across from him, telling him in clear words what his actions, his carelessness, had done. Chris leaned forward, his voice steady. What happened after that? Nathan hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the side of the menu before he spoke. I lost my job 2 weeks later. I wasn't in a good place to begin with, and that night didn't help. I stopped showing up, and when I did, I wasn't me. My boss saw it, my coworkers saw it. They let me go, said they hoped I'd get back on my feet, but that didn't happen right away. He looked up, his expression unreadable. I'm not saying you ruined my life. I did a good enough job of that on my own. But that moment, it mattered. More than it should have, probably. More than you'll ever really understand. Chris didn't speak for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle before finally exhaling. I don't know how to fix what happened. Nathan scoffed, shaking his head. You can't. Chris nodded once, accepting that. Then tell me what I can do. Nathan frowned, his fingers still against the table. Why do you care so much? Chris held his gaze, unwavering. Because I don't want to be someone who walks through life leaving damage in my wake without realizing it. And because you deserve more than just being another face in a story I forgot. Nathan didn't respond right away. He had spent so long carrying this memory, letting it define a part of him, letting it turn into something sharp and unmovable. He had imagined so many ways this conversation could go, but not this. Not someone willing to listen, to acknowledge, to take responsibility even when they didn't have to. Finally, after what felt like too long, he exhaled. I don't know what I want from you. Chris nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small notepad from his wallet. He scribbled something down, then slid it across the table. Nathan hesitated before picking it up. It was a phone number. Chris's personal number. When you figure it out, Chris said, his voice calm but firm. Call me. Nathan looked at the number, then back at Chris. He could have torn it up. He could have walked out, left this night as nothing more than a strange chapter in a long book of unresolved moments. But he didn't. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his pocket. Chris leaned back, signaling to the barista. We should at least order something. No point in sitting here for nothing. Nathan let out a small breath, something that almost resembled amusement. Fine. The waitress arrived, waiting for them to decide. Chris glanced at Nathan, raising an eyebrow. You pick. Nathan shook his head, looking down at the menu. All right, but I'm not letting you pay. Chris smirked slightly, the tension in the air finally shifting into something else, something that wasn't closure, but wasn't resentment either. We'll see about that. And for the first time that night, it felt like there was a way forward.